Hey, Dr. Wilson here. I'm a molecular and structural biologist, and I'm back to debunk some more COVID-19 misinformation. And this week, continuing on the trend of debunking a massive amount of COVID vaccine misinformation, we're going back to one of the old friends of the channel, James Corbett from the Corbett Report.
Welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
In this video, James and his guest will take turns spouting off misinformation about COVID vaccines, which is easily proven wrong by reading the studies that are publicly available. I'll link them down in the description so you can read them yourself, but I want you to notice that in this video, these two don't dive into the data at all. They merely show you headlines and say that things are true without actually backing any of it up. So really what they're doing here is using classic con artist tactics in order to make you feel afraid of the vaccine when really there's no reason to be. So let's hear what they have to say and I'll show you exactly why it's wrong.
How COVID-19 vaccine trials are rigged. And we're going to see a lot of this. While vaccine makers insist any COVID-19 vaccine reaching the market will have undergone rigorous testing, the way trial protocols are designed suggests these vaccines will not have a significant impact on infection rates, hospitalizations, or death.
Well, no. The first and most important goal of a vaccine is to prevent disease. And that's exactly what these clinical trials were set up to determine. Everybody in each vaccine clinical trial was monitored for symptoms that are consistent with COVID, but they also had to undergo self-testing and PCR testing in order to confirm an infection if they did have symptoms. The way that James and his host are talking would have you believe that they were only looking for cold-like symptoms, and that's not what was happening, and it's very easy to see that if you just take a few minutes to read the paper, something that I don't think they've done.
The only criterion for successful COVID-19 vaccine is a reduction of symptoms shared by both COVID-19 and, of course, the common cold.
Again, everybody in these trials were tested for COVID, regardless of whether or not they had symptoms. The results of every single COVID vaccine clinical trial shows without a doubt that these vaccines do in fact prevent disease. It is indeed expected to also prevent transmission of COVID from person to person, but those studies are not finished. They are ongoing. So if you hear people saying that the COVID vaccines do not prevent transmission, they are wrong. We don't know the actual answer to that yet, but we expect it to be, yeah, it does prevent transmission.
At least 2 cases of transverse myelitis, severe inflammation of the spinal cord, has been documented in AstraZeneca's trial, and the company, as we told you, temporarily halted its trial in September 2020.
There were 3, actually. 2 had received the vaccine and 1 had received the control. James's guest says this as it's a bad thing, but like the good, diligent researchers they are, they temporarily halted the AstraZeneca vaccine clinical trials in order to investigate these adverse events to see if they had anything to do with the vaccines. And after being reviewed by independent neurologists, they concluded that no, these effects had nothing to do with the vaccine at all.
So if the vaccine can't reduce infection, can't reduce hospitalization, and can't reduce death, then how's it going to end the pandemic? And it means anybody who takes this will be doing so in vain. And it seems like so many of these things are essentially, it's a religious kind of cult operation. It's all about belief.
Well, if you look at the data, instead of relying on belief, you'll see that the vaccines do in fact prevent illness, which thereby prevents death. If you have a significant portion of the population that receives the vaccine and thus cannot become severely ill with COVID, then you've essentially solved the problem that the pandemic poses in the first place, which is causing mass illness and death. That's how the vaccine is supposed to stop the pandemic. Again, we do expect it to stop transmission, but the data on that are still coming, so we can't say anything definitive yet.
Some COVID-19 vaccine candidates may make people more vulnerable to HIV.
This is the con artist tactic I mentioned earlier. This video is just a rapid fire of headlines without actually diving into the facts of each topic, because if they dove into the facts, you would see that all these headlines are 100% wrong. This HIV claim concerns the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is different from the Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines. The end result of all these COVID vaccines is the same. The goal is to get your body to see proteins from the SARS-CoV-2 virus so that your body can recognize them as foreign and thus become immune before you actually get infected with COVID. AstraZeneca accomplishes this by putting SARS-CoV-2 proteins into a harmless virus that will then deliver those proteins to your cells. This harmless virus is what we call a vector. It's a way to deliver things to your cells, and it's been used in the production of other vaccines in the past. This particular HIV concern originally came from researchers who were working with an experimental HIV vaccine that used the same vector that is now used in this COVID AstraZeneca vaccine. The researchers noticed that participants who had increased levels of antibodies against this vector virus seemed to get HIV more often than those who didn't have lots of antibodies against this vector virus. Although this result was concerning, follow-up work done by the same researchers found that these results were not reproducible, and that it does not have anything to do with the actual vaccine or any pre-existing antibodies that the patient might have. So clearly, when you dive into the information, you see that there is nothing to this claim, and it's literally just a scary, misleading headline.
And finally, South Korean authorities are going to stick to their flu vaccine plan, even though at least 48 people have died. James, this weekend tyranny gets deadlier and deadlier.
Unfortunately so, and let's bring that South Korea story up to date. The latest number that I could find is it's now 59 deaths attributed to this South Korean flu vaccination spree.
South Korea has massively boosted their flu vaccination campaign, so naturally there are going to be some individuals who coincidentally pass away in close proximity to the time in which they received their vaccines. The correct question to ask here is this a correlation or is it really a causation? And the Korean government suspended the flu vaccine campaign temporarily in order to answer this question. And guess what? They determined that the flu vaccines were still safe. There was no scientific evidence to say that the vaccines caused the deaths of these people. Dr. Young, a professor of preventative medicine in Seoul, South Korea, even commented that this is like reporting how many people died after eating breakfast.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. No, death, it's just a minor complication, guys. Who cares if people are dropping dead from these vaccines?
The irony here is unbelievable. Over 2 million people die from a highly infectious respiratory virus in less than a year, and these people just cry conspiracy. But then when a small handful of people die shortly after receiving a vaccine, and then science tells you that the vaccines had nothing to do with it, then that suddenly means all vaccines are dangerous, but that virus, that's still not dangerous. Sure.
They're not even attempting to pretend that this is about stopping infection of SARS-CoV-2. No, this is about reducing cold-like symptoms of runny nose and fever and headaches and what have you.
It's honestly embarrassing that he's saying this at this point. James Corbett, if you ever want to talk to me, either on your show or outside of cameras, I'm all game.
You hit on it there by saying this is almost like a religious thing. People have been indoctrinated into this cult where this is this existential threat, this black plague that's sweeping the world, and the only thing that can save us from that is it's going to have to be some sort of miraculous thing, and they're going to sell the vaccines as the miracle.
I'm not sure if he's forgetting about the very long list of other preventative measures that science has been telling us for a very long time are effective tools against this virus. But either way, he rejects all of those too, because he refuses to look at the data and instead relies on belief?
Now that is irony!
Well, that is James Corbett's Corbett Report debunked for a second time. He consistently spreads anti-science misinformation, and you can expect to see him featured again on this channel very soon. Until then, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I do hope you've learned something. As always, the links to all of the scientific studies and information I talk about in this video are linked in the description, so you can check them out for yourself. Other than that, don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me next Tuesday, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.